Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to ODI Global here today to celebrate the launch of Driving Inclusive and Sustainable Economic Transformation, a roadmap for low and middle income countries. If you didn't manage to grab it on your way in, do grab it on your way out. It is a physically hefty document, and I hope an intellectually hefty document as well. You can tell us at the end of today's discussion. My name is Sarah Colenbrander, and I lead the climate program here at ODI. And I just want to give a nod to all the people who are joining us virtually. I think we had 200 registered online, as well as the people who were able to come into ODI in person today. Thank you so much for making that journey. Let me open with 3 stark facts. First, 864 million people experienced severe food insecurity in 2023. That means 1 in 11 people went without food for at least a day, and often more. Second, over 30 years after the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was established, greenhouse gas emissions increased by 1.3% in 2023 relative to 2022 levels. In fact, emissions have risen every year since the UNFCCC was set up, apart from the brief exception during the COVID-19 pandemic. Those emissions are causing the floods, the storms, the extreme heat, and many of the other more severe and frequent impacts that are contributing to the terrible hunger and malnutrition we're seeing across the world. And third, the richest 10% of people account for over half of global emissions. I think probably almost everyone in this room and everyone online will fall into that category. The richest 10% of people comprises anyone who has an income above about US $41,000 a year. Of course, within that category, there's an ultra-rich. I don't think anyone in this room is likely to own a yacht or a private jet, though if you do, call me afterwards, we'll go for a spin. But there really is a sort of global discrepancy between that richest 10% and the poorest population. So I started with those 3 facts because I wanted to illustrate the point that underpinned the launch of this report today. We currently have an economic model that has generated huge improvements in living standards, but only for a small fraction of the global population. The wealth and opportunity enjoyed by the richest people in the world is almost inconceivable in historic terms, if you think of how most people live today or how most people lived 100 years ago. But millions, billions, have not seen the benefits. Unfortunately, most of them are bearing the costs in the form of a more hostile planet on which to scrape out their livelihoods and lives, and the tragic disappearance of the irreplaceable natural heritage that brings richness and meaning to so many of our lives. So it was with some of these kind of numbers and this context in mind that in 2019, the Chief Economist's Office at the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, and many of you will know CEDA, reached out to ODI. They shared with us that they were having challenges getting their economic, social, and environmental teams to work together. They had noticed, a little embarrassingly, that ODI was having the same problem. They suggested that we work together to help our in-house economists and our in-house social scientists and our in-house environmental scientists understand each other better, which they saw as a precondition for crafting a genuinely shared vision across these policy silos. Over the first couple of years of working together, it became clear to everyone that this was not a level playing field. Heads of state do not routinely consult even their nation's very top social and environmental scientists, although their economists will routinely have a seat at the table. Finance ministers hold many more levers of power than ministers for health, ministers for education, or the environment. There's a hierarchy. Economic growth is prioritized above social inclusion and poverty reduction. And those considerations are usually positioned above ecological sustainability. And the result of that realization within ODI and within CEDA is this report. Economic transformation remains probably the most politically resonant priority of governments because most people work their way out of poverty. Most political leaders therefore want to create more jobs and for those jobs to be more productive and better paid. So our point of departure today is to ask how economic transformation can be made more socially inclusive and more environmentally sustainable, so that the gains are shared more fairly within populations and that the industries that thrive do less damage to the planet. Over the last 5 years, we've had the great pleasure of working with CEDA and with partners all over the world, many of whom are online, to try and answer this question. I'm really delighted that so many of you were able to join us in person and virtually to hear what we've learned on this journey and to comment on it in the later part of today's event. So our discussion today has 3 parts. First, we are very fortunate to have Mavis Owusu-Gyamfi, President and CEO of the African Centre for Economic Transformation, joining us virtually. Hello, Mavis, to make keynote remarks. Secondly, we will welcome Vidya Diwakar, who is one of the authors of this flagship report, back to ODI, to share the key findings. And then third, we have a stellar panel lined up, a combination of virtually and online, to examine the barriers to and enablers of inclusive and sustainable economic transformation. We do have a hybrid panel because we are now taking climate change very seriously and trying to minimize flying. So big thanks for people for making the time, particularly with the difficult time zone for those in Indonesia. So big thank you to all our esteemed speakers. And now allow me to introduce the star of the show, Mavis. So as I said before, Mavis is President and CEO of ACET. ACET is Africa's leading economic policy institute, focused on moving Africa beyond growth and towards economic transformation. Mavis's impressive career spans 25 years in economic and social policy making across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. She has a track record with UK DFID, Save the Children, and the Power of Nutrition. Over the last 4 years as Executive Vice President at ACET, she has been instrumental in crafting ACET's strategy and driving its effectiveness and partnerships. ACET actually joined ODI at our Global Away Day last year, and it was really extraordinary to hear about the Institute's track record of creating a whole ecosystem of policy institutes across the continent, mobilizing resources for ACET and for its partners, and recruiting top talent to bolster their really pioneering research, advisory, and advocacy. Mavis is a Desmond Tutu Leadership Fellow and holds an MPhil from the University of Sussex. I apologise for waxing lyrical, Mavis. It is a really impressive CV. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And thank you for the invitation. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to say thank you to ODI for bringing us together to discuss this really important report. Given the state of our world, which I think you summarized so well with your first 3 statistics, sustainability and inclusion in economic transformation is more important than ever. Many low and middle income countries are juggling a number of complex and interrelated challenges, creating decent jobs for their rapidly growing youth population, increasing their revenues to navigate the fiscal constraints that they are currently facing, climate change, long-standing natural resource exploitation, limited access to financial markets, and geopolitical complexities. Today, I want to touch on 3 topics that I think are crucial to helping low and middle income countries, many of which are in Africa, to navigate most of these constraints. The first one is that they must go beyond growth and really commit to economic transformation. The second is they need to strengthen governance and introduce smarter regulations to support green development or green industrialization. And thirdly, they must prioritize shared power and gender equity as part of their economic transformation journey. Now, let me start with the first critical issue. Sarah, you talked about the fact that for us, it's all about economic transformation. You are right. At ACET, we don't believe growth is sufficient. It's necessary, but not sufficient. And we have a recipe for economic transformation, which we call growth with depth, DEPTH. And the reason we have this framework is, as most of you will know, what doesn't get measured doesn't progress. And so DEPTH means that growth must go beyond growth and focus on diversifying economies, Countries must diversify their economies from a reliance on a handful of raw materials. They must they must enhance their export competitiveness. They must improve productivity. They must really ensure that they are using technology to realize gains in the real economy. And most importantly, their growth must improve human well-being. So that's what the DEPTH stands for. What we have found in our analysis of transformation is that countries that transform their economies are more resilient to shocks. They tend to buckle slower when there's a global shock, and they recover faster. Those that are not transforming their economies struggle. Secondly, we have found from our recent transformation index, which we launched in 2024, and this index tracks 30 countries on the continent that represent 86.5% of GDP on the continent, that transformation overall has stagnated. Before you ask, we can only get the data, comparable data in those 30 countries. So, we need data, Africa. Now, what we found in our data really resonated with the ISET findings in your report. So low-income countries like Burundi, Mozambique, and Malawi are in a group of what we are calling low transforming economies. Lower middle-income countries like Eswatini tend to be medium transformers, whilst upper middle-income countries like Tunisia, Algeria, South Africa tend to be higher transformers. So even across these 30 countries, we see similar data to what you found in your report. But overall, whether you are a high transformer, a middle transformer, or a low transformer, we are finding that most of these countries in the index are faring poorly when it comes to diversification of their economies. Worryingly, we are seeing that a number of countries are actually seeing an increase in concentration of their top 5 exports. And they are not export competitive as a result. And whilst we've seen a minor progress in productivity remains low. It's about 25% out of 100. It's really low. So the 0.2% is problematic. And anybody in the room who works on economics knows that if you are struggling with low productivity, transforming your economies in itself become a challenge. We've also found that a lot of these countries, alongside their dependence on a handful of extractives, have low skills, and they have a tendency to operate only within their borders without looking at the possibility of regional value chains for higher returns. So given all of this, our key message to governments at the moment is you must be intentional in transforming your economies. When we looked at our data, transformation in a lot of countries were happening by default rather than by design. So as countries are growing, they seem to be pulling up transformation. But because it's not an intentional investment, as soon as growth starts to go down, you start to see transformation start to go down as well. So transformation, it's notwithstanding the shocks as a result of that. That's the first point. The second one is, as the ISET report rightly points out, low and middle-income countries must develop stronger governance and regulatory frameworks to support a more effective and greener industrialization pathway. Their current governance and institutional frameworks are generally weak. They keep countries from transforming. They leave room for jobless growth. They encourage environmental degradation over sustainable. And for far too long, they've kept many people from contributing and benefiting from the economy. One of the biggest opportunities I see right now for many low middle-income countries in Africa is around green minerals. And our leaders have also recognized that this is very important, as we saw in a lot of the speeches at the Africa Climate Summit in Nairobi, and we've heard in other speeches thus far. The world for decades, actually, let me say centuries, have run on African minerals. But African countries and people have not benefited from our natural wealth. So be it oil, be it gas, be it gold, diamond, etc. Countries have ceded long-term revenues to the highest bidder in favor of short-term influx of cash. And often, these reserves are sold for decades in advance. So when our children come to paying the debt that we've borrowed to develop our countries, they actually don't even have the resources in the form of these minerals to pay for, as a source of income to pay for debt. So this has been a lost opportunity, and we must not continue to repeat this trajectory. With critical minerals like lithium, cobalt, nickel, rare earth elements, copper, and aluminum, we must do it differently. We all know that Africa has 60% of the world's best solar resources, 30% of the world's critical minerals, and 2%, only 2% of the technology to transform this into industries that generate jobs for its people and provide much needed tax revenue. A lack of investment, a lack of infrastructure and skills means that these minerals are at risk of continuing to be exported in raw form, like their predecessors were in the carbon space, and as a result, further perpetuating unequal partnerships that leave African countries and their people behind. We can turn the tide. We must capitalize on the growing global focus on green energy transition, renewable energy resources, and green technology. The International Energy Association asserts that if countries meet their energy and climate pledges, mineral demand for clean energy technologies will more than double by 2030 and triple by 2040. We must use this as low and middle income countries as a motivation to finally build local specializations that tie into green regional value chains that can supply this growing global demand while ensuring that Africa and its people get their fair share, create sustainable employment, and protect the environment. So what we are asking countries to do is map out which countries will mine the minerals, identify who can produce the EV batteries, who can produce EV cars, who can make the packaging and do the marketing and export together, and collaborate by focusing on what you do best without trying to do it all. By doing this, we will improve efficiency and effectiveness by investing in skills and resources and technology that build industries that link into regional value chains and can compete globally. We can apply these same principles to sustainable agricultural value chains, light manufacturing industries such as textiles, etc. But to make this work, countries have to invest in partnerships that are mutually beneficial, not just one-sided, and strengthen relationships with development finance institutes, bilaterals, private sector to help raise financing and investment in this sector. And our partners need to see and respect Africa's ambition to build regional value chains around this trajectory to ensure that it really benefits from these critical minerals. Thirdly, countries must pair their transformation efforts with gender-responsive approaches for a powerful combination that can lift their economies. I cannot overemphasize the importance of shared power and ensuring that our policies and programs all work towards accelerating equality for all women. One of our most recent analyses found that there was not a clear line between economic transformation and gender equality. One does not necessarily beget the other. So what we have found that some top transformers, Tunisia, South Africa, Mauritius, Egypt, have a low score on the Gender Inequality Index. So as well as transforming their economies, we are seeing an improvement in gender equity. Others, like Morocco, had high levels of gender inequality. Conversely, countries that are making progress on gender equality, such as Cote d'Ivoire, the Gambia, Madagascar, etc., have experienced setbacks in economic transformation. So these contrasting trends demonstrate that contexts differ, and economic transformation does not automatically result in reduced inequality. Neither does reduced inequality necessarily drive economic transformation? So countries have to do both. They have to focus on transforming their economies, and they have to focus on doing it in a way that facilitates gender equality. This is the only way in which they are going to realize a more sustainable economic trajectory in the long term. And the most straightforward way to do this is to integrate gender equity into every aspect of economic transformation, governance, and policies, from budgeting to health finance, to economic policies, to infrastructure planning, technology, education, skills, and jobs. We have to start with gender inequity and look at policies to ensure that we do make progress on this. And gender-neutral policies cannot be acceptable. Furthermore, we must start to lay the foundations for gender transformation. Women and men, boys and girls must share space and share power to achieve better outcomes for all in the long run. Next month, ACET will be releasing our latest Africa Transformation Report, and it focuses on gender equity and equality and economic transformation. So look out for it if you want to learn more about what we have found. Sorry, Sarah, I had to do that small pitch there. Now, there's an African proverb which states, "A cat that dreams of becoming a lion must lose its appetite for rats." This means that to achieve greatness, countries must let go of old habits that hold back their progress. This requires them to pivot from the focus on pure growth, the focus on exporting raw materials, the focus on neutral economic policies, into focusing on the three priorities that I have outlined above. And that's why at ACET, we are working on all of these three issues. So really making sure that our growth with depth framework is adopted at the country level in sub-Saharan Africa. It's adopted by regional institutions, and it's used not just to support national development plans, but also to track progress. That is why we have adapted our growth with depth framework to have a clear gender focus. Secondly, we are also working to augment this framework to make it more adaptable to economic dynamics, including a sustainability index, so that it's more relevant for green economic transformation agenda. And finally, we are kicking off our green industrialization program. So Sarah and ODI colleagues, thank you so much for this critical research, which will be a great contribution to the question that we are posing to Africa policymakers all the time. What are you doing to embark on inclusive and transformative economic green growth path? And we look forward to working with you to take this critical agenda forward together. Once again, thank you for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you so much, Mavis. In theory, I meant to jump straight onto the next speaker now, but I feel like a lot of us, there were a lot of great numbers and factoids in Mavis's presentation then. So I just want to take a couple of questions from the audience, if there are any, so that we can speak while fresh in our minds before I bring up Vidya to speak to our report, which you should read before Mavis's. Does anyone in the audience have questions? Because otherwise I'll abuse my position as chair. And please send them online too, so I can access those. One here, please, and please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. First of all, yeah, I just want to thank you for the presentation. It was absolutely amazing. I work for the Center for Global Development, and I work on the European Finance program. So my question is on the European sphere, and that's why I think the research is so valuable right now, because, well, this year is where the next multi-annual financial framework budget for the EU gets allocated. So there's a lot of discussion about the Global Gateway Partnership Initiative, which obviously has to be founded on the win-win partnership that you discussed. And we are seeing that there is a massive Europeanization of aid that is happening. So we are seeing that there's a big focus only on hard infrastructures and not on this human development kind of investment that they're taking about. So my question is about, for example, as you mentioned in Côte d'Ivoire, I think last week, the Global Gateway sponsored a massive investment only on deforestation. So again, there's the concept of adding value addition process within the country, but only on extracting raw materials. So my question is about, do you think that this Europeanization of aid and this increase in tied aid especially, I think last year or a couple of years ago, it was reported it increased by 12% or something. So aid tied with investments that primarily benefit the European side. Do you see this as a worrying side, especially given the, as we know, this right wing, again, Europe first, US first approach that is very much worrying us on our side? Thank you so much.
I might take one more question if that's all right, Mavis. Thank you very much from CGD. Any others? Otherwise, maybe I might ask Mavis, you shared some really interesting stats about the concentration of exports and the prospects of green mineral supply chains. I wondered if you could perhaps comment on Africa's vast oil and gas reserves and how you see the production of those playing into a sustainable future, given that the continent does have an exceptionally low carbon footprint with a couple of notable exceptions. So how do you reconcile that story compared with the more straightforward critical minerals one? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So let me start with the first question. Look, none of us are comfortable with the geopolitical space within which we are operating right now, where nation states are thinking of themselves first. And I think for us, one of the fundamental issues we're saying to governments is, let's break the mold and think of the region first, rather than our countries first. Let's just change the mold, because going nation state by nation state is not going to help us as a continent. So let's collaborate, strengthen our capability, and then use that to compete with the world. The second thing that we keep reminding governments is that you cannot hand over your development to others. You need to drive your own development. So what is happening at the moment is, having handed over our development for decades to other people, we are beginning to feel the challenges of the current geopolitical environment. And so what we are saying is negotiate. Okay, negotiate for concessional finance, negotiate for debt, negotiate for investment, negotiate for all of that, but negotiate it as nation states and for the region, okay? And if something does not work in your favor, be bold enough to say, this is not working in our favor, okay? And we are not going to progress with it. But it doesn't make sense for Côte d'Ivoire to take something. Sorry, let me rephrase that. It doesn't make sense for Nigeria to say no and for Côte d'Ivoire to say yes. Because as soon as you do that, you break the agreement, okay? It becomes divide and rule. So that regional integration, that collaboration becomes really important. So I think it's a long way of saying that it's a horrible geopolitical space. We are encouraging our countries to go with a regional lens and a regional agenda for the benefit of our people, and to hold the world to account for better practices. So that is the position we are in. And part of this means that when we talk about our tax revenues, we start to push for, illicit financial flows, not just illicit financial flows that leave our continent from corruption, but illicit financial flows that leaves our continent from large multinationals not paying taxes. So these are all the things that we have to do to get the revenues we need, especially if we are not going to get it if the global north is changing how it engages with us. And to your point, Sarah, I hope I've answered your question. Is she nodding in the room or not? She is nodding great. And then to your point, Sarah, look, at ACET, we talk about just transition for all, okay? And just transition for all means that the energy transition will move at different paces for different parts of the continent. So we envisage that we're going to see green transitioning happening faster in East and Southern Africa, okay, than we are going to see, say, in West Africa, where we are sitting on a lot of oil and gas reserves. What we are saying is we will take the stepping stone of gas. Okay, we are asking our countries to look at gas as a stepping stone and observe the lessons learned in East and South and adopt that technology over time. So have a time frame for that transition. We don't anticipate that there's going to be a single transition across the continent. So having just said, we must work together and collaborate, we are also saying we must be pragmatic about what we can do and when. We cannot sit down and say that we should have low access to poor quality energy because the world has suddenly decided that we must shift to green transition when we only have 2% of the technology, whilst on our doorstep, we have gas and we can actually produce desperately needed energy for our people. So it will be a transition. And for us, that's what we call just transition, not just according to somebody else's transition. It's just for, I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you, Mavis. And I was just curious. I'm Australian, as most of you will be able to tell, and we love coal and we love gas. So there's no judgment. There's only curiosity about the prospects and the pathways for the region.
Oh, I wasn't taking it as judgment at all. And I'm very proud of our position.
Perfect. And so, of course, we're all here for the launch of this flagship report, Driving Inclusive and Sustainable Economic Transformation, Ways Forward in Low and Middle Income Countries. It is my great pleasure to invite Vidya Diwakar back to ODI to share the findings. So Vidya is a former research fellow from ODI, who currently serves as Deputy Director at the Chronic Poverty Advisory Network hosted at the Institute of Development Studies down the road in Brighton. She leads a suite of mixed method studies on poverty dynamics in Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia and Southeast Asia. So congratulations to Vidya and the rest of the team scattered around the room and online for this fantastic report. I'm going to take a second off center stage and let Vidya be the star of the show. Over to you, Vidya.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah, for that introduction as well. And thanks to all online and in person. As Sarah mentioned, I'll be speaking to some of the findings of this report, which is being launched at today's event. But before I go into that, I just want to understand the audience we have before us in the room and online in a bit more detail to understand the mix of these different entry points around inclusion, environmental sustainability, and economic transformation. So with that in mind, a question to the audience and online as well. You can raise your hands if that function allows. Raise your hands if you work primarily in your professional capacity on issues related to economic growth. Okay, so there's a couple of us in the room, and I see one hand raised over here, was it? If you don't mind me asking you, what does success typically look like from the entry point of economic growth in your field?
Incomes growing for the poorest and the poor, and with natural resource management, environmental sustainability, and of course, gender inclusion, great policies from government. It's a lot of things that need to come together to be able to achieve success, and they all come in drips and drabs, I would say.
Great, thank you for that response as well. So you'd started by saying income's growing, and that's really a key pillar of this economic growth agenda. Another question then, raise your hands if you work primarily on environmental sustainability. Okay, so Sarah, maybe I'll pose this question to you. What would you say is success in your field typically or primarily looks like?
Sorry, you have to hear from me again. I think it's people living lives of dignity and health within planetary boundaries.
Great, thank you. And then raise your hand if you work primarily on issues related to social inclusion. So a couple of us in the room as well. So with social inclusion in mind, this might draw attention to things, especially around, for example, the eradication of poverty, around promoting beneficial inclusion of different segments of society to participate fully in economies, societies, and so on. But some of your very valid responses also do draw attention to some of the fundamental challenges of working across disciplines and sectors. And governments as well face some of these challenges in reconciling different sometimes disparate objectives as well. And what we also see in today's current space is that economic growth is coming back on the policy agendas with renewed vigor in different ways for many governments and international actors as well, on the back of COVID-19, increased prevalence of different types of crisis, including increased cost of living and so forth. Yet with just 5 years left in pursuing the Sustainable Development Goals, it's imperative to strive, as we heard Sarah overview, it's imperative to strive for inclusive and environmentally sustainable economic transformation. In other words, yes, moving labor and capital from less to more productive firms, activities, and sectors, but doing so in ways that benefit all people while minimizing environmental harm as well. So this program that Sarah very nicely brought us together with overviewing at the start and led by Andrew and involving several in the room as well, has had a number of components. And I'll summarize just a portion of this components and invite some of the authors as well to join me after in responding to questions and answers. So if we could share some slides now, thank you. So one of the things that we've done in this report is have a better understanding of the state of play. What are the outcomes that we're seeing in terms of issues, in terms of progress or outcomes countries have been making in relation to environmental sustainability, in relation to social inclusion, and in relation to economic transformation, and the extent to which countries may or may not be achieving all three goals simultaneously. So we undertook a cluster analysis, and what we see from the pre-pandemic era, so from 2000 to about 2019 or so, using this data set, and based on different indicators that this ODI team had identified as being proxies or emblematic of the respective dimensions, is that there was a relative absence of triple wins across these three dimensions. There was instead sometimes quite an observable trade-off between a high degree of economic transformation. So for example, this is where cluster A countries tend to dominate. And those countries also then in turn having relatively low environmental sustainability outcomes and vice versa as well. At the same time, what we did see is that there were some countries, which we've called in this report cluster B countries, so that's the second rectangle in this diagram, which exemplified quite moderate tripartite gains. So they were generally above average across this pooled set of countries over the period analyzed, even if they weren't the highest performers across the set. Now, when we looked at what these countries were doing or their characteristics in a bit more detail, what we saw is that they generally had a relatively stronger degree of inclusion in the times and countries specified. Government effectiveness and reduced risk through different indices were also more prevalent in these cluster B countries or clusters with a stronger degree of inclusion as well. But again, these are some issues that we've explored with looking at several different hypotheses of what might be responsible or correlate to these different cluster performances. And what we also see promisingly is that there is a number of strategies and policies over the last 5 years in particular that have been emerging in response to promoting issues related to inclusion, environmental sustainability of economic transformation as well. So now in this context, what we're seeing instead is that implementation tends to be the big issue. But given that there is just a short amount of time, what I'll do is I'll just summarize some of the types of strategies linked to the implementation in two domains in particular, so in manufacturing and in climate finance. And then we can go on to see how that might have applied to one of the countries in which had exhibited some of these moderate tripartite gains. So if we consider the manufacturing sector, some of our colleagues in the room undertook some analysis around the textiles and clothing sector. And what we see around these three dimensions, around economic transformation, promoting economic transformation in the textile and clothing sector often involves quite a large capital investment and technology transfer. At the same time, there were sometimes smaller, more bottom-up investments that drives gain in productivity and job creation, a key example being in Bangladesh as one such country that had pursued this approach. At the same time, backing these processes have been a degree of an enabling environment, so things like free trade zones, encouraging domestic linkages, foreign investment, transfer of skills and knowledge as well, all being quite important conditions to supporting this economic transformation. Now, on the inclusion aspect of this transformation, what we see in this textile and clothing sector is that it's quite often international pressures or advocacy by large groups and social movements that's been driving the inclusion of this sector as well. The aftermath of the Rana Plaza fire and the collapse in 2013 in Bangladesh is one such example where we see quite a bit of action following this crisis. And then on the environmental sustainability dimension of this economic transformation, again, what we see is that it's sometimes national policies, sometimes also international pressures and standards set by importers, which are important in promoting the environmental sustainability dimensions of this transformation. Ultimately, what the analysis highlighted is that a key barrier to ISET progress, so inclusive sustainable economic transformation progress in this textile and clothing sector, is that low prices are quite central to competitiveness, and few buyers are often, for example, unwilling to pay a green premium. So there are still these constraints to promoting these tripartite gains in the sector. Another area that the report drew attention to is that around climate finance, and it identified climate finance as holding particular promise in achieving these tripartite outcomes. Again, we can hear from others in the room who'd been involved or led some of this analysis. And its promise emerges insofar as it's intended to integrate development and environmental objectives by and large. So what the report did is it explored an analysis of multilateral climate funds and multilateral development bank projects. And what it's identified is, for example, the MCFs quite often developed conceptual frameworks. They evaluated the impacts of different parts of their portfolios to draw out lessons with regards to some of these outcomes. Some of the elements that enabled these more positive tripartite outcomes from the entry point of climate finance included things like diverse partnerships across projects, engagement across scales, targeted support for the private sector in low and lower middle income countries, especially including smallholder farmers also being quite instrumental in this process. But by and large, what emerged out of this analysis was the recognition that more could be done to unlock private finance to support climate action and tripartite outcomes more broadly. So that's on an overall bird's eye view. Now, other speakers here today will speak to different regions or countries in Asia, so I'll instead consider an application of these different issues or sectors to the realization of these tripartite outcomes in Kenya. Now, in Kenya, what we saw between 2000 and 2022 is that income per capita increased nearly fivefold. Productivity growth was particularly fast in industry. There was a degree of poverty reduction taking place prior to the pandemic. Carbon emissions were increasing, but renewable energy consumption was quite high. Now, some key ingredients in Kenya in driving or leading to some of these tripartite outcomes included things like social movements or international frameworks. So the CSO-led Kenya SDG Forum is one that was identified as gathering data and producing an annual report on progress of SDG implementation at the country level. So SDGs, of course, are key pillars that reinforce some of those tripartite gains in principle, especially as well as to a degree around implementation. The MDP also coordinates the SDG implementation across ministries and counties in the country. There's a dedicated SDG desk as well, which facilitates government and non-governmental interactions. So these international frameworks at a country or county level as well have been quite critical. Alongside this was a vision for economic transformation that was seen as Kenya envisioning itself as being a newly industrializing middle-income country by 2030, the National Industrialization Policy Framework giving some consideration to inclusion and environmental aspects within it. But more recently as well, the bottom-up economic transformation agenda, which was launched in 2022, was seen to recognize, again, environmental and climate change interventions as a key enabler to achieving economic transformation and social inclusion objectives. There was a rigorous process of consultation involved as well in achieving these, in driving this process. The last point I'll make as well is that in terms of climate finance, the county climate change funds in Kenya also helped identify, prioritize, and finance investments to reduce climate risk and achieve adaptation as well. Its success was in the piloted version of the county climate funds was seen in terms of then in 2022, the launch of a nationally scaled financing locally led climate action program worth close to $50 million in county climate change investment grants. The government commitment to this agenda also really did help attract international climate finance for these efforts as well. So by and large, what we see is that, again, there are different pathways or different processes through which countries have been able to achieve different degrees of inclusive and sustainable economic transformation, but there's still room for this economic transformation to be more transformative. So in terms of the economic structure of each country, more inclusive, for example, we saw in Kenya in terms of its poverty reduction outcomes and so on, and environmentally sustainable as well in terms of renewable energy usage and water supply, especially in Bangladesh and Indonesia, some of which we'll hear more about next. So thank you for your time, and I'll pass the floor back to Sarah.
I'm aware we're running a little bit over, so I'm just going to ask for one really good question from the audience. No pressure. Anyone got one incisive question on this report?
Thank you, Sheila Page at ODI Associate. What I noticed in your presentation and also in when I was reading the sectoral parts of the report yesterday is that on textiles and clothing, what the effective starting point for reform in a sense is external. How is this a pattern for development? I mean, we can't really hope for more Rana disasters. It doesn't seem that you have identified anything other than a series of possible things that might happen and therefore result in good growth. And although there's a great deal in the report about what must be done and what must happen, there's very little about how or why you can get these processes started. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about some generalizable policy relevant recommendations.
Great. Well, thanks for that question, Sheila. And I think there are outlined in the report several pathways through which some of these outcomes have been observed. Some, as you note, rightly so, are external pressures. And some, as you also point to, are crisis related as the whole windows of opportunity types of arguments. But we also see other forms of policy implications and recommendations. So one is around recognizing that, yes, there may be certain vested interests against promoting some of these ISET outcomes. So acknowledging the opposition. Another is around mobilizing reform-minded coalitions of interested stakeholders, mobilizing private sector in certain cases been quite important. So through value chain standards, for example, we've seen some interventions there, which has enabled this to be achieved. So for example, observing mandatory and voluntary trade agreements as well, including the reformed WTO regulations and norms, supporting as well different types of arrangements and mechanisms. So coherent institutional arrangements and incentives to promote these. So of course, there's different degrees, as I noted, of the outcomes that we do observe, but some of it have been homegrown. So we do see, for example, the processes outlined in Kenya included some piloting of those county climate change funds, which was then scaled up and so forth. So there are different pathways. And I think the entry point that you use to enter the discussion as well matters. So in the case of Kenya, this was also supported by processes of devolution on the governance side of it, from the inclusion side through the CSO-led SDG forum, from the economic transformation side through the visions outlined in Vision 2030 and the beta policy as well. So different entry points can lead to a similar type of landing zone as well.
I also maybe want to give, we've got a couple of other authors in the room who worked on this, including, sorry, Jody, right in the front seat, and Sherilyn online, who are part of those case studies, if you want to perhaps provide some additional reflections on Sheila's great question.
Thanks. So I think it is a really important question, you know, the extent to which there's these kind of exogenous shocks or pressures versus a kind of endogenous, you know, more inclusive, environmentally friendly process. How you know, can that get started in what context? I mean, we haven't found it in the textiles and clothing industry. Obviously, it's got an extremely long history. If you look at the kind of different segments of the value chain, textiles, production, you know, versus the kind of clothing nodes. And, you know, there's always been, you know, the history of the industry, because it is, you know, it's the entry level kind of first rung into the industrialization process. I mean, there's some authors even say that this industry, you know, it's literally, you know, it's the driver of the manufacturing sector and so on. So, you know, countries want to get a foothold into the industry. So there has been this concern about a race to the bottom. You know, obviously we've had, you know, in the 1990s, the expansion of the global value chain literature as production became more footloose, as countries opened up to investment and so on. So there's quite a lot of literature on, you know, how to avoid that race to the bottom, concerns about the kind of economic upgrading, you know, in terms of competitiveness challenges from developed country markets versus the concerns about erosion of labour standards and so on. But there's much less, you know, so there's a lot of literature on economic upgrading, not a huge amount on social upgrading, I would say, but it's there. And then when it comes to environmental upgrading, even less. So, you know, we had to try and pull this together within a coherent kind of conceptual framework. And I'm sorry, but there's just no clear-cut answers. And, you know, it does seem to suggest that most of the pressures have been, for change, have been exogenous rather than endogenous, I would say, yeah.
Thank you so much, Jody. Sherilyn, do you want to add briefly?
Yeah, so I wanted to share some positive things that we've seen happening in the three country case studies, so Indonesia, Bangladesh, and Kenya. So of course there are factors that enable, we see enablers, but we also see factors that hinder the joined up thinking in terms of policy making. So on the enablers, it is very interesting to see like how an embedded multi-sectoral approach and participatory approach, when the framework is in place, then it facilitates this conversation. So we've seen this happening, for example, because the devolution is by law in Kenya by law they have a mandate to collect local perspectives, then it's automatically embedded. And from that framework, you know, their new plan, like the bottom-up economic transformation, it is very participative. Like they have like almost 50 economic forums before a development plan has been finalized. So in that sense, you collect all the perspective. And it also happened in Bangladesh. what I see is a key ingredient. I'm very interested with the Bangladesh Delta Plan 2100, and they formulated it in 2018. So it's 80 years down the road, and they included scientists from the climate side, social scientists. So when you lock in an an inclusive and environmentally economic transformation 80 years down the line, then you lock in that plan that can survive political leadership and, political interest and all the succeeding investment strategies, financing, they all anchor this in this long-term plan. So I think this strategy to lock in those vision that is more balanced in terms of laws, in terms of long-term plans is one key element to pursue everything that comes after it. Of course, on the hindrance, I like what Mavis said, like, what don't get measured don't progress. And what we've seen in the countries is that what is the areas that are more understood tend to be prioritized. So I think this is an entry point, like we saw that there are others like external factors that can influence, but this has to be the influence to some extent can be just more on, the frameworks, the financing, but everything has to go institutionally. Like those understanding on a multi-sectoral level, and then those who understand it, they have coordination problems. Some of our Indonesian colleagues will attest to that. There are different renewable energy targets because there are different ministries having different mandates. So there are lots of opportunities for the external actors to support homegrown initiatives, but it has to come from the inside. So I can share other interesting examples, but I'll give the chance to others for now.
Thank you so much. That was Jodie Keane and Sherilyn Raga, who are in ODI's International Economic Development Group, with a question from Sheila, also in ODI's International Economic Development Group. So one of the great successes of this project is that now our economists are talking about climate and social issues without the social and climate teams needing to participate.
Please stop insulting all of us.
Sorry, that wasn't meant to be insulting. That was just a recognition of the rich debate within the team. I apologize.
Doing it in the 1980s. Yeah.
I've read Dirk's papers from the early 2000s and Simon Maxwell. You have fantastic legacy in this. It was just meant to be an affectionate joke. There is really great work dating back 2 decades from the team, and now it is more cross-program. I haven't read the ones from the 80s and 90s, only the early 2000s. Anyway, we've had some really interesting examples from Bangladesh and Kenya, but we also have some fantastic panelists joining us online. We have Adi Halamanjaya and Balgas Inaya, who will be speaking to lessons from Indonesia. And we have Stephen Danyo, who will be speaking to lessons from Nepal. So we're really lucky to have them joining virtually today. Thank you so much. And I have nodded to Jodie and Sherilyn's great work on this report, but I also want to shout out to Tony from our Development and Public Finance team, and to Andrew, who's led this whole project, who will be joining us up here shortly. Excuse me. So first, let me welcome Adi and Balgas. Adi Halamanjaya is a climate finance and fiscal policy expert. She is currently the executive director of, do we have Adi online? Because I can only see Balgas. Adi, do you want to pop on video? Okay, no, can't pop video, but hopefully we can hear you.
Yes, thank you.
Fantastic. So Adi previously served as a consultant for the World Bank, Indonesia's Ministry of Finance, the Centre for International Forestry Research, UNDP, and multiple climate funds. And Adi is also a former ODI colleague before my time, I admit. She earned her PhD in International Development in 2014 from the University of East Anglia. Balgas Inaya is a researcher and evaluator at the Dalla Institute for Environment and Society in Indonesia, where I believe Adi used to work. So Balgas is experienced in conducting research and evaluation in projects related to climate change mitigation and adaptation, including on just transitions, energy transitions, and energy policy. So Balgas was the lead author of the Indonesian case study conducted for this project, and we look forward to hearing from both of you.
Thanks, Sarah. So let me start the presentation. So I will share my screen first. Can you see my presentation now?
Yes, we can. Could you do full screen, please? Thank you so much.
Cool. Okay, thank you so much, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, and evening. My name is Bagis Sinaya, but you can call me Agis. I am a researcher and also a evaluator at the Dala Institute. I'm here with ID from Just Transition ID, and we were both involved in the ISET study for the Indonesian case study. And this particular study for Indonesian case is focusing on the energy transition agenda in the country. And before I continue my presentations, I would like to take this opportunity to thank ODI colleagues as well for giving the opportunity for us to be part of this ISET study. So yeah, because the Indonesia case study is about the energy transition agenda. So I will start with the Indonesian current energy landscape. So as you can see here in my slide, that as of 2023, coal still dominates our energy mix, with renewables only make up around 13%. And this is still far from our 25 target of 23%. And several barriers such as limited policy support and persistent fossil fuel subsidies, and then the underutilizations of renewable energy kind of resources hinder this progress. And due to this kind of issue, there has been a change just recently. There has been a change in renewable energy target in the new national energy policy, which is from 23% by 2025 to 19 to 21% by 2023. So there's a lot of change in the process at the moment. And because since the ISET report for Indonesia case was produced in 2023, and there have been changes in the current development of energy transition in Indonesia. So just recently, our newly elected Indonesian president, Prabowo Subianto, has just announced the plans for retiring all fossil fuels plants and build 70 gigawatts of renewable power plants within the next 15 years. And the goal is to achieve the net zero for 2050. However, his government or his administration plans to postpone the retirement of coal power plants, delaying their full shutdown until 2040. So this highlights the ongoing tensions between the reducing fossil fuels reliance and ensuring energy security, while also needs to commit to the energy transition agenda. And also we know the recent geopolitical issue really influenced the future of energy transition in Indonesia. On the international front, just recently, I believe all the people here also knows that United States has backed out from its leadership role in Just Energy Transition Partnership. And this shift has really significant influence or implication for the funding and also the process of the Just Energy Transition implementations in Indonesia. And also, regarding the commitment of the newly elected presidents to build the renewable and energy power plants, the President Prabowo has shown strong support for biofuel programs here, for the renewable energy kind of programs. So he focused on the biosolar and also biodiesel sourced from the crude palm oil. So it says that it's renewable, but I don't know, like, it's still questionable. And these becomes the main components of the renewable energy agenda at the moment because of the new leadership. And then also we know that just recently as well, Indonesia is also plans to build nuclear power plants totaling 4 gigawatts of capacity. And this is really signaling a broader strategy for diversifying the country's energy portfolio. So this is the recent development at the moment. And back to the study, and to better understand the Indonesian energy transitions, it's really crucial to know political economy of the energy transitions. From this study, we identify the challenges of the political economy across 3 levels, which is national policy, national policy level, operator level, and also project implementation level. So the operator level here refers to the state-owned enterprises, while the project implementations refers to the projects implemented by vendors or developers. So at the national policy level, you can see that the challenge is one of the challenges policy instability. We know that with frequent shifts and inconsistencies in energy regulations, particularly during leadership change, it is causing uncertainty for long-term impacts of long-term effect of the energy transition progress in Indonesia. And also, this is because there are still, our policy mainly, even though they acknowledge, the just energy transition agenda, and then also the needs the needs to commit for the net zero by 2050. Our policy are still heavily influenced by the upstream fossil fuel interests. And then it is prioritizing coal and other fossil fuels over renewables alternatives, which can be seen why they changed the target of the renewable energy mix in our energy mix in Indonesia. And then also the geopolitical influence as an external pressure, which I have been mentioned before, it is really also affecting the progress of the transitions in Indonesia at the moment. And still at the national policy level, we know that there is a fragmented governance because for the energy sector, there are several key players here, like ministries, and also like from different ministries are regulating state-owned electricity or utility companies here in Indonesia. So PLN is the state-owned electricity company in Indonesia. It is governed, or it is getting mandates from 3 ministries, which is from the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources, Ministry of State-owned Enterprise, and also Ministry of Finance. So there are fragmented governance, and it is really having conflicting priorities among these key players. And also looking at the operational level, we know that at the moment there have been governance and corruption issues within state-owned enterprises like PLN and also Pertamina, and this also hinder efficient and renewable energy deployment. And this is because this is happening because of the structural barriers as well from the SOEs. And then we know that PLN's monopoly and also long-term coal contracts, it limits the growth of renewables, and it is questioning the environmental sustainability of the energy transition agenda in Indonesia. And also we know that there are currently new players from China for the renewable energy sector, so that also touch on the nickel mining, the upstream of the energy transitions. It presents both opportunities and challenges, but still it is still become questions as well in terms of the transparency and also competitions with other with the local players in Indonesia. Also, we know that there's also emerging hydrogen market here. So this is become a kind of good opportunity, but still questionable. And then we know like what will be the next like step this one. And then lastly, at the project implementation level, we also identify that there are kind of corruptions and also scandals at the implementation level, particularly from the vendors or the third-party companies that helps the projects or national strategic projects, strategic national projects, and this is really this is why there are so many projects that have been delayed, and also the executions of the project are not going really well, and then the impacts of social and then also economic and also environment also being questioned. And this is also related to the local resistance of community and community impacts. So we know that the energy projects often face oppositions due to land disputes, also concerns from the local communities. And these have been common challenge at the moment in Indonesia. And this also relates to the weak local capacity, both in terms of the technical expertise and also financial resources. So this is slowing the energy transition project progress. And then the last one is related to the regulatory bottlenecks. We know that there is complex permitting process, bureaucratic inefficiencies that continues to really hinder the implementations of energy transitions that is sustainable, inclusive, and also environment sustainable and also inclusive. And from this kind of identifications of challenges and opportunities, we may questions what will be the next things that we need to do as a country to really commit the need to achieve our commitment. So after this, I will hand over to Heidi to really explain.
I'm very sorry, Bulgus. I'm going to have to jump in because we do have another panelist to speak, and we are running short of time. Perhaps you would be happy to upload the slides in the chat and we can circulate them to participants afterwards. And I know people will come back to you with some questions about that political economy. So very sorry for cutting short an interesting presentation, but we do very much want to hear from Stephen as well.
Yeah.
Thank you very much to Bulgus for her presentation. We'll ask everyone to share their presentations afterwards and send them around to participants. It'll probably take a little while, but we'll get them to you by the end of the day if people send their slide decks. Yeah. Sorry, let me find where I am. So hold questions to Bulgus and Adi for the moment as I hand over to Stephen Danyo, who has been the World Bank sector leader for sustainable development for the Maldives, Nepal, and Sri Lanka for the past 4 years. He is also a senior environmental specialist at the bank. So of particular salience today, Stephen leads the World Bank's participation in Nepal's partnership platform on green, resilient, inclusive development, or GRID. So GRID includes 15 other international development partners. Stephen is also the team leader for the Nepal GRID Policy Operations Series, which provides budget support for these policy actions. So over the past 21 years at the World Bank, Stephen has shaped or led the delivery of integrated development approaches that build resilience, reduce the carbon footprint, and sustain natural wealth for poverty reduction and shared prosperity. So brings a long history of working at this challenging nexus. Stephen, over to you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you for inviting me to speak on this panel. I read the report last night, and it really resonated with me and the work that we've been doing at the bank. It would be very interesting to do a deeper dive on Nepal. Unfortunately, we only have 5 minutes or so. I think we're running out of time. So I'll try to add value to this discussion and focus on how Nepal has been putting in place this partnership platform on green, resilient, inclusive development. Of course, the World Bank is just one partner. My job, as I came in as part of the country management team at the time 4 years ago, was to operationalize green, resilient, inclusive development and equip Nepal and partners to work together to make that happen. And this was in recognition that growth is not enough, that it's not about the quantity of growth per se, it's about the quality of the growth. So as as Mavis said earlier, it's diversification, added value, productivity. But beyond that, growth has to be resilient, and growth has to be sustainable, and growth has to be more inclusive. And you can't have one without the other. And that's what we are trying to operationalize. So to make that work, countries need to invest in partnerships, as Mavis said. I want to echo that point, and that's what Nepal did. That's what the development partners are doing in Nepal. And there are two main tools that we've been working on that help operationalize this. One is Nepal's homegrown strategic action plan for green, resilient, inclusive development. And that's a $10 billion program over 10 years for 10 priority transitions. And then also backing those investments up is a policy reform program. And that is reinforced with budget support from the World Bank and then also from the Asian Development Bank. So Asian Development Bank's lending in Nepal is actually a little bit bigger than the World Bank's. So by working together, we're able to align our policy dialogues, provide technical assistance to the government of Nepal for a policy reform agenda for some of the priorities that are in the green, resilient, inclusive development vision that the country has, and strengthen the partnership in a very operational, practical way. What this means is that we had to, over time, bring partners around the table, including the IMF, the British Embassy in Kathmandu, the United Nations agencies, many sectors of the government, and really equip Nepal to take the leadership on this. Ideally, this presentation right now would be led by somebody from the Ministry of Finance in Nepal, which leads the effort in Nepal, but I'm happy to just summarize it for you. There have been several other big high-level events where Nepal has been leading and saying a lot of the same things that I'm doing. So what we did is, with the policy reform agenda and our budget support operations, with Nepal's strategic action plan with $10 billion over 10 years for 10 transitions, we really needed to make sure that projects, practices, policies, and partners were all aligned around this agenda. So that took quite some time working at various levels of action. So it's not just flying up at 20,000 feet with all of this strategery, as George W. Bush allegedly said. I don't think he actually said that, but I still love that word, strategery. This strategic work can, oftentimes it can get hidden with some of the real things that have been happening on the ground. So let me shift to how this engagement over the past few years has led to some tangible differences in how we make investment and policy decisions. If I have time, I have 4 brief examples I want to run past you that I personally have been involved in. There's many others. Let's start with one that I think is fairly successful so far. 4 years ago, there was very little dialogue and very little investment on air quality. It's a very big problem in the Indo-Gangetic Plain. It's something that is a regional issue that has to be tackled regionally. But of course, countries are sovereign, and the action is always going to be at the country level, and specifically at local levels. So one of the main policy reforms that Nepal engaged in, reinforced by several different development partners through a suite of analytics and dialogues over time, is they put in place what they call a green tax, which is really a carbon tax. And it was a tax on imported fossil fuel products at the India-Nepal border. This is already in 2024, this was implemented in July 2024. And in 2024, it's already led to a nearly 1% increase in government revenues because there's very little leakage in that tax, and also nearly 1% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. The modeling for the air pollution particulate matter is a bit more complex. We don't really have a number on that. Greenhouse gas is a little bit easier. But that's pretty tangible, and that will continue, hopefully, if they don't have any policy reversals. So far, they haven't had any policy reversals in a few years of the policy reform agenda. There's a couple years left in the series of the budget support operations for policy reforms. So that's one tangible example. And it's being backed now by some private and public sector investment that's getting organized with various development partners coming in to support various pieces of the agenda. So that's in the pipeline. So it's not just wishful thinking in the future. The second one is on forests. Now, Nepal is not a deep dive in your report, but I'd like to highlight that maybe some of you know in the room know that Nepal is one of the only countries in the world, one of the only developing countries in the world to have expanded forest cover significantly, from 25% 3 decades ago to 46% today. And it did that through a community-based model. So the issue of having shared power and equality for all is really key to achieving durable development results. But there is a gap in the contribution of the sector to the resilience and sustainability of growth and the creation of jobs and income. And that is that it's been purely focused on conservation. And so now the country wants to add value to that sector through furniture production and things like that, not just sending out raw materials, but adding value to small and medium enterprises that rely on that sector. So this is the direction the country is going, and there are a series of policy reforms, 2022 forest regulation that help articulate that strengthen the role of women in the community forest user groups. Community forest user groups touch on 60% of Nepali households, so they're very much a political force in the government's, in the country's politics, and that's very important when you look at these kinds of transitions through a political economy lens, which is one of the points in your report. So it remains to be seen what happens in the future with this, if they're ultimately successful or if they overreach. But there's various pieces of investment that are coming together from the climate investment funds of the MDBs hosted by the World Bank to the Green Climate Fund, I think is considering some sort of investment, not with us. Government budget, community investments, private sector investments, very small private sector stuff. No one's talking about big plantations or anything. And then carbon finance.
1 minute warning, Stephen.
Yeah, 1 minute warning. And then carbon finance and results-based financing. So these are just some examples. And I'll take the last minute to highlight some examples that are not working. And I'll conclude with a point about that. So because of this process, we all work together with the government to say, look, we have to do things differently. Business as usual is not going to get us to where we need to go. But it's really a heavy push. So we had a new water supply operation and added in a watershed component to make sure that that water supply is more resilient and sustainable in the face of a changing climate. But that watershed component hasn't really gone anywhere. Similarly, we have a big roads investment, and one of the innovations was to carry out forest landscape planning throughout the road corridor. And that's still ongoing. We're trying to make that happen with the government, but it's really hard to get the forest ministry and the roads department to work together on this shared agenda. So to make all of this work, we have to be involved for the long haul. We have to be consistent in our investment policy dialogues. And this is one of the risks, I think, that we collectively, through various government changes and through changes in staffing in our institutions, we may not be in it for the long haul. That's very much a risk. And I think it's something we need to think very closely about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that final point you finished on has been a really big theme today, starting from Mavis's comment about intentionality through to Vidya's point about getting the institutions and incentives right. Being in it for the long haul is kind of a stronger way of framing that. I'm going to give everyone a chance to ask questions now of Adi, Bulgus, and Stephen, but I just want to first bring up the authors of the report who are in the room so that you can also interrogate them about any particularly interesting details. So that would be Dr. Andrew Shepherd, Vidya, of course, you've already met, and Tony Kamninga from our Development and Public Finance team. So I have lots of questions, but I've already abused my position as chair once. So I'm going to open the floor up for anyone who wants to ask questions about the report or about those lessons from Indonesia and Nepal. And also questions online. We've got a couple. If you've got questions for Mavis, they need to come through in the next 6 minutes, by the way, and maybe others can stay for an extra 5 if they need to. please.
Okay. I have a question
Sorry,
to,
introduce yourself,
sorry,
please.
Richard Alexander from SOAS. I have a question to all of you, but this may be relevant to Mavis as well, given her reference to external players in Africa. And of course, one of the more recent external players in Africa is China. And I noticed that our colleague from Indonesia referred to Chinese involvement. And I wondered, with the strong statement from the current US government that they are not interested in green energy, that they consider climate issues to be explicitly woke, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I wonder whether China could usefully fill a gap that up to now the West has at least to an extent late. I wondered whether China could be a future source of assistance for sustainable development.
Other questions in the room or online? Got one over here, and I've actually just got one online that I'll read out as well.
Hi, thank you so much for these presentations. I'm from the FCDO, and so I have a slightly cheating question in a way, which is, what would the authors like for donors to take from this report and to do differently or more of?
I'm so glad you asked that, because that was my go-to question. And then I just want to read a question out from Sandra Martinson online, who asked about, as the foundations for productivity and transformation, do we need to think much more about investments in education, healthcare, and social protection as an enabler? And what is the role of international development finance versus domestic resources on those agendas? So not worlds apart from our FCDO question. Maybe with that, I'm going to ask Andrew, who led this project, if he wants to have a stab first and then move right along, so Tony and Vidya have a moment to prepare.
Okay, well, I'll try and take the question about donors. I suppose there are things to keep doing that many donors are already doing. So, for example, the long haul battle about subsidies, which provide the wrong sort of signals to companies and to individuals and households. And that is a real long haul, and there are many setbacks in that. So it's very much something that agencies need to be in for the long term. What to keep doing also is climate finance, not surprisingly. We found that climate finance, although there were many drawbacks and there were many hiccups along the way, many of the climate finance specialist agencies have been doing a good job. But one should say that, more is needed, that it needs to be easier to access. It needs to reach further down to people. There's not much reaching down to people. If you look at, for example, smallholder farmers, there's very little benefit trickling through to smallholder farmers from climate finance. I think also, switching from donors slightly, but international governments, if you like, we've made a number of mentions of international trade agreements and value chain standards. And I think the more that international agencies can be positive about those and promote some of these agendas through those mechanisms, tough though it may be in some cases, that would also be good. In terms of Sheila's question about how, these are kind of points that are getting there, and I think the points that have been made by Stephen and others are also getting there. We all recognize that ministries of finance are at the hub of government and they allocate resources and so on. They tend to allocate resources according to that hierarchy that we mentioned right from the beginning. What we thought was that perhaps there could be units within ministries of finance which were interdisciplinary, which took different perspectives and attempted to bring them together. So that's perhaps another response to the how question. So get, environmental specialists, get social science specialists from different ministries working with the Ministry of Finance, or recruit specialists into the Ministry of Finance and try and get a slightly more integrated programming of budgeting at the heart of government. I'll stop there, thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm just aware that Mavis has to run, so I'm going to give her a chance to just give a last comment or two if she's still online, and if she had to already dash, then we thank her in absentia. Angela? She is online, wonderful. Words of wisdom, Mavis, and then over to you, Tony.
So I think just very quickly, it's been it's thought-provoking listening to these discussions from an analytical lens, and then looking at how we balance it with the political economy within which we are operating, or within which governments are operating. And the point that was made earlier on around China, for example, recent analysis that has been done by SIA talks about opportunities for China to support green industrialization and green development on the continent. But then this sits along a geopolitical space where countries that are engaging with China are at risk of losing other resources. So these are all the tensions that we as countries are trying to navigate as they think through how do we drive green industrialization, how do we drive sustainable development on the continent. So fully endorse recommendations, fully endorse the paper. I think the next thing that we really need to be thinking through is how do you navigate this within a very complex geopolitical space and a very complex political economy at the national level, so that we can realize the benefits. So that would be my last parting point. And I'm really sorry I have to jump off. I had said I needed to leave at 12:30. So thank you very much once again.
So I'm going to ask Tony, and then we'll jump back online to let AD Vargas and Stephen make some remarks, and then finish up with Vidya, who can tie us back to the report, if that works. And then there will be lunch in the next room for those of you who are here in person. And apologies to those online, it's only sandwiches. You're not missing out that much. Tony.
All right, thank you. So for me, I think I'm going to talk about some aspect of China's involvement in terms of climate financing providing. From our report, we do, of course, notice, and as Vidya mentioned, that climate finance has got a significant potential to advance these ACET objectives. But there is, of course, need for more climate finance, and it is inadequate, as we know, at the moment. And the fact that US is pulling out of the climate agreement, that's kind of a huge blow for the efforts to increase climate finance. Because recently, I think of 2022, actually, the US provided about 14 billion in climate finance, and that pulling out of that agreement is going to be a huge blow as a major contributor. But that being said, China is also already providing in climate finance as it is at the moment. It is also providing mostly through MDBs, its contribution to multilateral development banks. So it's going to be, it is already a major contributor now, but it's also going to be a more better or a more contributing country in the foreseeable future. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Tony. AD and Vargas, would you like to comment from Indonesia's perspective, either about what donors can do differently or about the role of China, which you did touch on very briefly?
Yes, thank you, Sarah. I'm sorry that I have a technical issue, so I hope that you can hear me clearly. So I just want to respond to the questions or the kind of response on the China's players as well in the energy transitions. So, and then the relations to the JETP financiers, I think it is really a complex issue, because many JETP financiers, especially from Western countries, they are really cautious about funding from China's-led projects, because due to concerns of transparency, also governance, and also geopolitical tension. So it is really a complex issue if we are talking about the China's players in the energy transitions in Indonesia. And also perhaps just to kind of wrap up the discussions today, I think the Indonesia's energy transition is really a complex journey, because it's shaped by political, also economic and social kind of dynamics at every level, from national policy until the implementation levels. So we know that there are challenges like vested interests, governance issues, also local resistance, and including the current geopolitical issues. So it is still really a long journey, and then I think the key successful things that we can do is through the inclusive collaborations, when we trying to align with the national ambitions, but also we need to really acknowledge and consider the local needs. And then it's just the work of all levels of stakeholders. So I think, that's from my side, and over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much. And Stephen, this must be an equally live issue in Nepal, given its geography and its status as a least developed country and major recipient. Any thoughts?
Well, just overall thoughts. I think the scope of the ISET report is so broad. The concept of ISET is so broad, or the concept of grid is so broad. It's very big. It's perceived as being very academic within a Ministry of Finance, for example. So there's very much a need to prioritize specific investments, and within those specific activities and specific policies as well. And that process for prioritization is quite important, to have criteria for prioritizing and a very strong process for bringing along different partners and players in that prioritization process.
Thank you so much. And lastly, to Vidya to bring us home with final reflections.
Thank you. Thanks, Sarah and colleagues. I think getting us back to the central premise of the report, some of the key points that were made was one around acknowledging the opposition, which I'd spoken to a bit earlier. So acknowledge that there are likely to be opposition from powerful interests, develop tactics to counter this, for example, through compensation for losses and so forth. As part of this, also think and working politically is a good premise to keep in mind, and other types of institutional arrangements to counter some of these passive or more explicit oppositions. And then the third, so acknowledge the opposition, supports these institutional mechanisms and support structures that promote tripartite outcomes. And then thirdly, mobilize key actors. So mobilize social movements, for example, in place, trade unions, civil society organizations, mobilize the private sector, and so forth, because as we heard from AD, Stephen, colleagues, it's really a coalition of factors that is needed in the long term to promote ISET outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you, Vidya. Good note to end on. Look, the last thing I want to say is a huge thank you to all of you who came into ODI today, and all of you who've joined us online for the last hour and a half. We're really grateful that so many of you share our interest in this extremely challenging topic that we have written a lot about, but much, much more has been and could be written about. The authors will be here for lunch. Please do find them and ask more questions, or for those of you online, don't hesitate to follow up. We will share the resources with everyone who participated. Thank you to everyone for joining us today, and we really appreciate it. A special thanks to Angela, who's the mastermind of this whole event. So,
Thank you to you too.
goodbye. Please join us next door for a cup of coffee and